Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Emanuel Kuczycki, and I'm part of the management committee of the Helsinki Initiative on Multilingualism in Scholarly Communication. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar of the Helsinki Initiative, which aims to share experiences on promoting, supporting, and researching multilingualism in various areas of science. Today, we will have 3 inspiring presentations by 4 presenters. Each presenter will have 20 minutes for the presentation, and then we will start the discussion. We will start with the presentation by Tatsuya Amano, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland, Australia, and the Deputy Director in Research at the Centre for Biodiversity and Conservation Science, also at the University of Queensland. Tatsuya will be discussing language barriers in conservation science. Next, we will hear from Lynne Bowker, who is a full professor at the University of Ottawa, Canada, and visiting researchers in the Scholarly Communication Research Group at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan. Lynne will shed light on machine translation and scholarly communication. And the third presentation will be provided by Mikael Laakso and Janne Pölönen, who will talk about mapping the global landscape of scholarly journals. Mikael is an associate professor in information systems science at Hankel School of Economics in Helsinki and a project worker at the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies. Janne is the Secretary General of the Publication Forum at the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies. Before we start, I want to mention a few words about the recording of this webinar. We will be recording, and we are recording the webinar, and we will provide this recording with subtitles in various languages. We must live up to our commitments, and multilingualism in scholarly communication cannot be reduced solely to publications. So an essential part of the Helsinki Initiative is to make all kinds of scientific production available in all languages. And now we can begin. Tatsuya, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. So I will start sharing my screen. Good. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yep, that's great. Okay. So first of all, thanks very much for the kind introduction. I have been long hoping to have a chance to interact with this Helsinki Initiative. So it is my great pleasure to be able to give this presentation on our Translate project today in this seminar. So 4 years ago, we launched this project called the Translate project. So this is the website. So please visit this website if you're interested. And we are planning to investigate consequences of language barriers in science, and more specifically in conservation science, which is my discipline. So biodiversity conservation essentially aims to understand how species are threatened to extinction and how we can effectively conserve those species. So our work around this issue of language barriers, inevitably focuses largely on this specific discipline. But I believe the findings are applicable to many other disciplines. So I hope you will find it interesting and important. And in this presentation, I will give you an overview of our project's outcome so far. So first of all, I will start with why language matters, especially in my discipline, biodiversity conservation. So here, the map on the left shows the states and territories where English is the first language. And the map on the right is the distribution of threatened species, which is our focus. And as you can see, we have 2 very contrasting maps. The regions where biodiversity is the richest and is threatened the most, and therefore conservation is needed the most, are often regions where English is not widely spoken. And as you might know, when tackling global challenges such as the biodiversity crisis, the key is to involve and engage people, because it is quite often those people that cause those issues and also have a potential to solve those issues. And those people around the world, especially in biodiversity hotspots, use a wide range of languages to communicate, up to 7,000 languages. So to me, it only seems natural and absolutely necessary to consider how having so many languages among us might influence our understanding of what is going on around the world. And that's why our Translate project has been investigating the many consequences of language barriers in biodiversity conservation and more broadly in science in general. This includes language barriers to the global synthesis and local application of scientific evidence, as well as language barriers to the generation of scientific evidence by non-native English speakers. And more specifically, in this paper published in 2016, we showed that up to 36% of scientific documents on biodiversity conservation appeared to be published in languages other than English. But such non-English language scientific evidence is likely underused in the global level synthesis of scientific evidence because it's not readily accessible. So this is the language barrier to the global synthesis of evidence. And then there's another type of language barriers where scientific evidence available only in English is not effectively used in the local application of scientific evidence, such as local decision-making in countries where English is not widely spoken. Finally, because of the language barrier, non-native English speakers may not be able to fully contribute to the generation of scientific evidence. So this is the language barrier to the generation of scientific evidence. So in this talk, I will introduce some of our works on each type of language barriers in science. So first of all, how is non-English language science used in global evidence synthesis? We looked at the proportion of references cited in those 8 international assessments on biodiversity by language. So these assessments are written by IPBES, which is a really important international initiative on biodiversity conservation. And not surprisingly, English language references dominate in most assessments, with on average 96% of the references cited being in English. And this is in clear contrast to the result we saw earlier, that 36% of existing conservation literature was written in non-English languages. So this clearly indicates that most of the existing non-English language science is not being used in global level evidence synthesis. So next, what are the consequences of ignoring non-English language science? In this paper, we conducted comprehensive searches for non-English language literature on conservation. The Conservation Evidence Database stores English language studies that test the effectiveness of conservation actions identified based on a set of selection criteria. So our project has used the same criteria to identify relevant non-English language studies. And we identified 1,234 non-English language studies that provide evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions, compared to 4,412 English language studies at the Conservation Evidence Database. So we can at least say that by ignoring non-English language science, we could be losing access to this amount of scientific evidence. And during the searches, we have also identified 466 journals in 19 languages, some of which have been publishing papers since the 19th century. So this result alone also indicates that a non-negligible amount of scientific evidence is still being published in non-English languages too. And many people often assume that such non-English language studies are diminishing as science is becoming increasingly globalized. But in this study led by Sean Chaudhry, we showed that the number of publications on biodiversity conservation has actually been increasing in most languages, especially in Spanish, Portuguese, simplified Chinese, Russian, and so on. So contrary to a common perception, the importance of non-English language knowledge in conservation is certainly not diminishing. And another problem is that ignoring non-English language science can cause severe biases in our understanding of biodiversity. In the research area of healthcare, it has been shown that more statistically significant results are more likely to be published in English rather than in non-English languages. So this issue is known as language bias in evidence synthesis, or more specifically, language bias in statistical results, meaning that the nature and direction of a study's results can affect what language it is published in. And we found language bias in statistical results in conservation too. In this paper, we showed that the effect size was hugely different between English language studies and Japanese language studies, although all of these studies were used in the same meta-analysis. And in this case, ignoring non-English language studies would bias the conclusion of meta-analysis. However, a slightly different type of language bias might also exist, especially in ecology and biodiversity conservation, which is language bias in study characteristics. For example, studies conducted on a local species might be more likely to get published in non-English language journals, as those studies would not be of high interest to international readers. And in our recent work, we showed that language bias in study characteristics does exist, having serious consequences for evidence synthesis. In this figure, these blue grid cells show the distribution of English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions stored in the conservation evidence database. And you can see that English language studies are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in certain countries, such as the UK and the US. And there is a huge gap in the availability of evidence in other parts of the world, including the most biodiverse regions, such as Latin America, Africa, and most parts of Asia. Now, when we searched non-English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions, we found a number of relevant non-English language studies in those regions with little information based on English language studies, such as Latin America, Russia, and East Asia. And those non-English language studies often provide unique evidence on the conservation of threatened species. Examples include a Spanish language study on endangered Andean mountain cats in northern Patagonia, and a Japanese language study on endangered Pakistan fish owls. This clearly indicates that there is a systematic bias in study locations and species between English and non-English language studies. And by ignoring non-English language studies, we could lose important scientific evidence for those areas and species with little or even no English language evidence. Okay, so let's now move on to another type of language barriers to the local application of scientific knowledge. First of all, how is evidence made available in different languages used in local decision-making? For this, we first identified national, often governmental reports on the state of biodiversity in countries where English is not an official language, and looked at the proportion of references cited in those reports by language. And we were surprised at the very high proportion of non-English language references in most countries, shown in yellow and orange here. Across these 37 countries, 65% of the references cited was, on average, in a non-English language. And as you might remember, this is a stark contrast to the international assessments, where only 3.4% of the references were written in non-English languages. So this means that by ignoring non-English language literature, international assessments may overlook important knowledge on local and national biodiversity. And this high proportion of non-English language references in national biodiversity reports is partly due to report authors recognizing the importance of non-English language scientific evidence. For example, when we surveyed those report authors, 75% of them answered that they cited non-English language papers because they were indeed relevant to their reports. And in contrast, only 25% of the report authors answered that they cited non-English language papers because they are just easy to understand. This clearly indicates that in those countries where English is not an official language, non-English language literature is still being used because they indeed provide relevant evidence and not because they are just easier to understand. We also asked those report authors how English language barriers might have impeded the use of English language literature in their reports. And a quarter of the report authors answered that they struggled with understanding English language literature when writing their reports. So this also indicates that language barriers indeed pose a serious barrier to the uptake of scientific evidence that is available only in English. Okay, so lastly, let me also touch on language barriers to the generation of scientific evidence by non-native English speakers. Because now science is conducted largely in English, non-native English speakers can face multiple barriers when conducting different types of scientific activities in English, such as paper reading, writing, publication, and research dissemination. And in our latest study, we tried to quantify those barriers for non-native English speakers by comparing the amount of effort needed to conduct different scientific activities in English between non-native and native English speakers. For this, we surveyed 908 environmental scientists from 8 different countries, and we selected these 8 countries based on their English proficiency and income levels, so that we can compare results between researchers of different linguistic and economic backgrounds. And what we found was striking, I would say. When comparing native and non-native English speakers with only one publication, so this is essentially the comparison of early career researchers, our survey shows that non-native English speakers need 91% more time to read each paper in English. So this means their hurdle is almost twice as high as that of native English speakers. Then they also need 51% more time to write each paper in English. And before they can submit, they still need to ask someone to proofread their English for most of their papers. Even then, their papers are more likely to be rejected simply due to their English writing. And that frequency is 2.6 times higher in non-native English speakers than native English speakers. And there's also a huge difference in the frequency of language-related paper revision. So here, non-native English speakers are requested to revise their papers 12 times more often than native English speakers. And when preparing an oral presentation, they also need 94% more time than native English speakers. And what's more, 30% of them often decide not to attend an international conference. And half of them decide not to give an oral presentation due to English language barriers. But it's not the end of the race. As long as you are in a research career, you will face these barriers every time you do any of these scientific activities. So it's now clear that these disadvantages can impede the participation and career development of non-native English speakers in science, seriously impeding their contribution to the generation of scientific evidence globally. So now that we hopefully all know language barriers can have serious consequences for conservation and science, the question is how we can solve these problems. I would say it's not easy at all, and we definitely need a concerted effort at every single level, from individuals to institutions and societies. So in this article, we compiled 10 simple tips for overcoming different types of language barriers in science. I won't go into the detail of each point today, but let me show you a few examples. First, disseminate research in multiple languages. Some academic journals or increasing number of academic journals now encourage their authors to provide abstracts in non-English languages and also write a blog post on their papers in other relevant languages. So this is a recent example from the project I'm involved in, where we provided abstracts in 7 different languages. And it seems that providing non-English language abstract does help decision makers. In our survey with authors of national biodiversity reports, almost half of the authors reported that having non-English language titles and abstracts would help them search and understand English language literature. Next, make sure to use knowledge sourced from multiple languages. Of course, this depends on the focus of your activities, but if you are working on issues that occur across multiple countries, never assume that all relevant information is available only in English. And one simple solution to this is to find collaborators who are native speakers of different languages, just like we did for this study. So today, science is highly globalized, so finding native speakers of, for example, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Chinese around you is not that difficult. And this also highlights the importance of developing culturally diverse environments in academia. We need a diverse range of people to make the best use of knowledge that is available from around the world. We also need to use appropriate literature search systems to find non-English language literature. For example, you can use Google Scholar, which covers pretty much any language, and local literature search systems that are specific to each language. See this paper for a list of such language-specific literature search systems. And we have also compiled a list of 466 peer-reviewed journals in non-English languages. And box 1 of this paper also provides some practical suggestions on how we could make better use of non-English language literature. So please have a look. We still have so many things to do in order to overcome language barriers for non-native English speakers. For example, a small number of journals already provide very good English editing support for non-native English speakers. So we should definitely expand such efforts to many other journals. And some conferences have also recently started to provide support for non-native English speakers, such as allowing multi-language presentations or offering mentoring system where non-native English speakers can receive support for presentation preparations. And related to this, just recently, in January this year, the journal Science declared that they will ban the use of text generated by ChatGPT or any other similar AI tools. Obviously, this resulted from the concern that some people might use ChatGPT when writing their papers. This is kind of understandable, and it's becoming a huge issue in universities as well. However, ChatGPT and many other similar AI tools obviously can provide very useful and importantly free or affordable English editing services for non-native English speakers. And this is particularly important in terms of achieving equity in science, because as a recent work showed, researchers from lower income countries can't afford to use paid English editing services and are therefore disproportionately disadvantaged by this policy update. So clearly, science's updated policies reflect a biased native English speaker-oriented view of the use of AI tools in scientific writing. So we immediately wrote a letter to Science, led by Violeta Verdejo Espinola, explaining how those AI tools could help to achieve better equity in science by reducing language barriers. And the good news is that in response to our letter, the journal has announced that they recognize potentially acceptable use of AI tools and may consider adjusting the updated policies in the future. So we still need more voices to change their policies, but this example clearly shows that many journals still don't provide genuine support to non-native English speakers, and we need a concerted effort to change this situation. Okay, so that basically concludes my talk today. And lastly, I'd like to thank all the collaborators of our Translate project for the huge, truly huge contribution. we're still working on many other exciting research and solutions, so please do visit our website. And if you're interested, contact us anytime. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much. This really inspiring presentation and a huge amount of work you have done to promote multilingualism in scholarly communication. Really, really amazing work. And I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of questions or comments, but as I mentioned, we will have 3 consecutively presentations, and then we will start the discussion. So now I would like to ask Lynne to provide her talk.
Okay, thank you so much, Tatsuya, and I'm really happy to be speaking after you because I think I hope that I will echo or support many of the points that you raised. My background is actually as a translation researcher, specializing in tools to support the translation process, which includes machine translation. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about machine translation, what we might need to know about it, and how we can use it more effectively to support multilingual scholarly communication. So machine translation is actually not a new technology. It's getting a lot of press lately, but it has a long history that goes back to the 1940s. But originally, the people who set out to develop machine translation tools tried to imitate a little bit the way that people process language. So they were trying to program computers with very large dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, and really complex sets of grammatical rules about how we could put different words together. So a little bit similar to the way that people process language. But of course, people use a lot of other information to process language as well. We can use the context, and really we use just our knowledge of the way the world works to interpret things very quickly. And computers will never have that. They don't have any real world knowledge, so they cannot process language the way that people do. So the original early machine translation systems, well, in fact, the first 50 years of machine translation systems were actually not that good. You know, they were very slow. They produced low quality work. And so because they were not good, they were not widely adopted. But starting from around the 1990s, the landscape changed. Technology had advanced so much. Computers were very fast now, powerful, much cheaper, easily accessible. And we also saw that because of that, because everyone had a computer on their desktop, people started using computers to generate texts, right? So no more handwriting, no more typing, but using word processing tools to create texts in digital format. And of course, that was the same period where we saw the World Wide Web emerge and the internet become more widespread. And so not only was it easy to create documents, it was easy to share them and to access them. So that situation really set up an opportunity that prompted computer scientists and developers to think about processing language in a completely different way. Instead of trying to imitate people, they said, what could we let the computers do that they're actually really good at? Because clearly they're not good at linguistics. They're not good at real world knowledge. What are the strengths of computers? And computers have 2, at least, very evident strengths where they actually outperform people. One of them is in pattern matching, and the other one is in performing rapid calculations. They can do math, very complex math, very quickly. So the developers said, well, why not try to approach language processing using these strengths of computers? And so they kind of created an approach to language processing that we now call a data-driven approach. And it produced really a massive leap forward in terms of the quality of the translation that these tools are now able to provide. It's not perfect. It's not problem-free, right? Machine translation is not a panacea. It's not a magical solution that will solve all our problems. As Tatsuya said, the challenge of multilingual science, multilingual research is quite complex, and we're going to have to, I think, approach it on multiple fronts, right? It's not going to be a single solution that fixes the situation. So machine translation is not a magical solution, but I think it has a role to play. I think it can make a contribution in supporting multilingual science. But in order to do that, I think we need for people to understand a little bit more about this technology, how it works, what are the risks, and maybe how we can optimize it, how we can use it to our advantage. So a data-driven approach basically is these machine translation systems are using similar approaches to the large language models that ChatGPT uses. And of course, everyone has heard of ChatGPT. So it's a similar type of technology. It needs a really huge quantity of data to work well. People can learn from just a handful of examples, but computers need hundreds of thousands of examples to learn effectively. So we're talking very, very large volumes of data. But that's not enough. We can't just throw more data at the problem. We actually have to be a little bit selective and choose the right kind of data. These tools are generative, they're derivative, so they're producing text based on examples that they've already seen. And if they haven't seen enough examples, then they haven't learned properly how to operate. So we need to be selective and find the right kind of data. And in a context like translation, we see that there are some languages and some disciplines that have a lot of data available. And then there are other languages or other domains where there is perhaps less data available. So in the lingo of natural language processing, we talk about high resource, lots of data, or low resource, less data. And it's a little bit like if you've seen any of the press about ChatGPT and other similar tools, like ones that can generate images like DALL-E. You might have heard of this problem where the AI images seem to do a good job producing faces, but they really struggle to produce hands, for example. And so you see AI generated images of people where they have a fairly normal looking face, but they might have like 12 fingers, or their hand, 2 thumbs or something like that. And it's a little bit the same issue. If you think about all the data that's out there, there are a lot of pictures of people's faces on the web, and there are fewer pictures of people's hands. And also, hands are really kind of a flexible part of our body. We can do lots of things with them. So they're shown in many different positions, but there are not a lot of photos of hands in the same position. So it's a little bit similar when we're working with languages. We have high and low resource language situations, and we also have high and low domain and text type situations. And sometimes we end up with a high resource language in a high resource domain, and it's quite easy to put a corpus or a collection of texts together. So we might think of languages like English and French as being very high resource languages, lots of data available in them. And, in particular, we might say lots of recipes available in French. Everybody loves French cooking, or lots of computer manuals available in English, because a lot of the software is produced in the US, for example, so it comes with English language documentation. But we might also find a situation where we have high resource languages, but low resource domains. So English text on something like raising reindeer, it's not a sort of topic that gets as much press, as much writing about it as computer user manuals. Or French language texts on the sport of cricket, right? We're much more likely to find English language, or maybe some languages from India where cricket is popular, or from the West Indies. But in France, cricket's not a popular sport, so perhaps not as many documents on that topic. We could have the other situation where we have a lower resource language, but within that language, many texts on a particular topic. So if we think of Polish or Finnish as being lower resource languages, but within those languages, which types of domains are very well covered? You know, Poland is part of the EU, so there's lots of administrative texts available from EU corpora, texts on telecommunications in Finnish. And then, of course, we have the situation which is low resource and low domain. And then we really struggle to put a large enough, high quality corpus together for machine translation to learn effectively. And that's already complicated enough, but translation adds one more twist into the mix, and that's the fact that we need to actually have a bilingual parallel corpus. So it's not just a case of putting together a collection in English and a collection in French. That collection actually has to represent translations of one another. So we might end up with a situation where there are high resource languages, languages that have a lot of speakers, languages for which there are a lot of texts available, like Russian and Bengali, for example, both have around 250 million speakers. So independently, they are both high resource languages, but there's not a lot of translation activity between those two languages. So that means that it's difficult to put this kind of parallel bilingual corpus together for those two languages, even though they're both high resource languages in their own right. So now we have this situation where we need not only high resource languages, but a high resource language pair where there's lots of translation activity and a relatively popular domain in order to put an effective corpus together. And of course, we're talking about languages as if there was one variety of each language, but you know, we all know that there can be different varieties within a language. So if we are trying to put together a corpus for a particular variety, like French Canadian or Australian English, it becomes more challenging, and we are left in that situation where, again, it's a lower resource situation. So this just is to set the scene a little bit about why data-driven machine translation is not as effective in all languages or for all text types or all domains. So how can we solve the problem of working with lower resource text types or languages? One approach has been to do what is called a pivot, which means basically a two-step process where you, if you want to translate from Spanish to Chinese, for example, you might go through English as an intermediary step. So it becomes a sort of two-step process. First translate from Spanish to English, and then translate from English to Chinese. So of course, when we have two steps, we have twice as many opportunities to introduce problems, and any error that gets made in the first stage of the translation gets carried forward into the second stage and kind of compounded, or you know, kind of, yeah, the situation is exacerbated. So pivot translation is used as a solution, but it's not a problem-free solution. Another approach that's becoming more popular is to generate synthetic data. And this is done by using machine translation to create data for machine translation. So we have already seen that there are some quality issues in low resource machine translation situations. So taking the output, which is, you know, likely to have some problems in it, and using that to further feed the system is again exacerbating the situation. So machine translation is not problem-free, but it can still be, I think, a useful resource if we're pretty smart about the way that we tackle it. So what I wanted to talk about today is the idea that authors can make a contribution to improving the situation. As Tatsuya said, there are actually numerous players, and we all need to do our part. And I only have 20 minutes today, so I can't talk about everyone, but the publishers, the editors, there are definitely roles for them to play as well. But today I'm going to focus on the authors of the scientific articles and look at what we can do. And one of the things that we can do is simply write in other languages, as Tatsuya has already said, and make those resources accessible. So these data-driven systems basically scrape data from the web And so if it's available in open access form, it's available to improve the quality of the machine translation systems. Even if we're not able to write or publish entire papers in other languages, we can still do multilingual abstracts, which is becoming more accepted and encouraged even by some journals. And we can also write more popularized versions of our research paper through science communication, things like plain language summaries. All of these things will help because they will make more data available in other languages on these topics, which are not necessarily widely covered at the moment. So anything that we can do to increase the volume of data out there in other languages will eventually improve the quality of machine translation into those languages. The other thing that authors can do is to improve their own machine translation literacy. So again, understanding a little bit about the pros and cons of this technology and how to optimize it effectively. So just being here today at this webinar is a great start for people who didn't know much about machine translation previously. So understanding how data-driven MT works is what I've just explained to you. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I call translation-friendly writing. And translation-friendly writing is something that can be done in any language. So although I'm speaking in English today, the concepts apply to all languages. And it's basically a way of writing that is clear and unambiguous. So the specific techniques for doing that might differ from one language to another, but the principle applies to all languages, which basically means, write in a clear and unambiguous way. We often think, as people who interact with machine translation systems, that our main option is to put the text through the machine translation system, get the output, and then start the difficult and sort of, unpleasant job of repairing the translation, fixing up the output. And for many people, they will be facing that task in their second language or their less dominant language, right? Many people who are using machine translation as a writing aid are using it to try and produce a text in their less dominant language. So repairing the output of machine translation or fixing up the output in your less dominant language is actually really challenging. And there's a better way to kind of affect the quality of machine translation, and that's by writing the input in a way that will make it amenable or suitable for translation. And so this is what translation-friendly writing is about. And the first thing I think that we need to do, and this is something that everyone can do who writes up their research, is to have it in your mind at the time of writing that someone out there may be accessing your work through translation and likely through machine translation. So just to have that in your mind from the outset will help you kind of think about, as Tatsuya was saying, be considerate of non-native speakers. Think about the fact that their means of accessing your work, which you want to share, their means of doing that might be through translation. So the abbreviation, which we have in English, garbage in, garbage out, applies very well to machine translation. If you give it, even if you give a professional human translator a poorly constructed source text, why do you think that the translation process would automatically convert that into something beautiful and usable? It won't. If there are problems in the source text, those problems are going to be reproduced or maybe even amplified in the translation. So putting yourself in the mindset of, if I give good input, it means that someone can access my work through machine translation. So how can we, what should we have in mind when we're talking about good input? And they're actually little things, because as I said at the very beginning, computers don't process language the way people do. So they're not looking for the same cues or, they're not looking for the same things that people look for. So if we give our text to a human translator is a really quite a skilled professional, and they can compensate for some problems in the source text. They can fix spelling or grammar or punctuation mistakes. They can make educated guesses about what seems to be a logical interpretation of your text. They can refer to other parts of your text for context. They can go back to the introduction, or they can skip ahead to the conclusion conclusion and look for information that will help them make sense of something that's not particularly well expressed. But machine translation tools can't do this, right? They can't compensate for problems in the source text. They really process the character string as it's presented. They have no real-world knowledge at all, and they process each sentence as a separate unit. So they can't look ahead or, look back for information elsewhere in the text. So I've put together a few tips that are non-language specific. As I said, there are other tips for writing well in your own language that will be specific to your language. But some things that we can keep in mind that are kind of more general are, use a grammar and spelling checker before you send off your text to the machine translation system. Put it through an automated grammar and spelling checker. It will at least catch those small to a human, but big issue to a computer problems. Lengthy sentences are very problematic for machine translation systems. So if you could write in a shorter sentence, that would be good, but not too short, because machines, although they don't use a wide range of context, they do use the sentence. They process things at a sentence level. So if your sentence is too short, really telescoped, not using effective, relative pronouns to connect different pieces of the sentence, then it will also struggle. So you want to aim for sort of mid-range sentences of 10 to 25 words. Be very consistent with your terminology, right? Synonyms are rarely true synonyms. Most synonyms are quasi-synonyms, and they do mean different things, and they will get translated in a different way. So be very, very consistent with your terminology. Minimize acronyms and abbreviations. All scientific fields are guilty of having them. Again, there's can be good reasons for using them, but in an abstract or in a popularized piece, which is a little bit shorter, maybe try to avoid the abbreviations and use the full term, because these will be translated more accurately. Same for pronouns, especially when we're dealing with languages that have grammatical gender and other languages that don't. When we're moving between those two types of languages, pronouns are a very problematic issue. So again, while we don't want to avoid pronouns in a very long text because it makes it heavy, at least in an abstract or in a popularized piece, you can avoid pronouns by repeating the noun, and you're going to get a better translation. Avoid using all caps. Sometimes we think that would be a good way to set off a title. For a computer, the case is a really important means of distinguishing between words that are called homographs that have the same spelling. So a word like Polish, something coming from Poland, versus polish, the capital letter on that makes a difference. And if there is no distinction in the case between the first letter and the rest of the letters, then the machine translation system is at a disadvantage. Also avoid unnecessary line breaks. Because the system processes one sentence at a time, it will interpret a line break, a hard line break, not a word wrap, but a hard line break, as a new unit, even if it's in the middle of a sentence or in a kind of in the middle of a phrase or a semantic unit. So these are little things that don't cause problems for people, but will cause problems for machine translation systems. So there's small things that we can do to try and improve our chances of getting good output. Tatsuya mentioned also that we can use other tools now, writing tools, tools for summarizing. We can also use things like ChatGPT for machine translation. It's not the strength of that tool, I would say. It has better uses, but if you are going to use ChatGPT for translation, think very carefully about how you formulate your prompt, because that will influence tremendously the quality of the translated output. Yeah, there's also something in these tools which is called temperature, which basically means how much freedom you give the system to be creative with language. If you keep the temperature low, then the output will likely be more accurate. It's more predictable. If you're looking for a more creative translation, which is probably not so much the case for academic translations, then you can turn the temperature up. But it's better to keep it a bit lower, I think, for more accurate translations. And of course, as Tatsuya said, these tools can be used to support writing and editing in various ways. And so these might actually be better uses of AI tools than translation, which it was not really designed for. So things like paraphrasing, simplifying your sentences, summarizing, creating plain language summaries, these can be great tools for preparing a text. And we have options that are called plain language checkers, which will again help to make sure that your text is written in a clear and unambiguous way for optimizing the success of machine translation. Okay. Other issues that we need to think about, as I said, today I focused really on authors, but we do have to think about the evolving landscapes of attitudes and practices. Again, Tatsuya mentioned this, are these tools permitted? Should we allow them? I think we need a much more nuanced approach to this. There's a big difference between using tools for content generation and using tools for linguistic support. And I think we need to recognize that using language support is, how is it any different to use a tool than to ask your lab mate or, someone else to edit your work? It's linguistic support, and I think we need to develop more nuanced policies around it rather than coming up with just an outright ban on this type of technology. And of course, beyond authors. Today I focused on authors, but we do have other options and possibilities for exploring the potential of machine translation for things like knowledge discovery, knowledge assimilation, which is reading and understanding information in other languages, multilingual subtitles, for example, and combining machine translation with other tools for an overall kind of writing aid package, but that will be a topic for another day. Okay, I will say if you're interested in this, I co-authored a book in 2019 where we tried to tackle a lot of these issues, machine translation and global research. Unfortunately, that one's not in open access, so I'm sorry about that, my bad, but maybe your library has it. The other one, Demystifying Translation, is not exclusively about machine translation, but it does have a chapter in it, and that one's open access. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more, you can find some information there. Okay, and I will end there.
Thank you very much, Lynne, for showing us how we can proceed with those challenges mentioned by Tatsuya. And now we will have the third presentation. So, Mikael, Janne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you, Lynne and Tatsuya, for your inspiring presentations. I feel a bit hesitant now. You both had so polished and clear instructions for everyone, practical tips and things that we can actually take forward immediately. But I think our presentation with Janne is a bit more work in progress, and maybe we could also need some of your help in the discussion about thinking about the actual approach that we're doing. But before I go ahead, I'll share my screen here. So can you see the slides in kind of full screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the topic of this project that's kind of in early stages and we've just gotten going is about taking a stab at mapping the global landscape of journals. And this is a topic that I've been fascinated with for, I think, over a decade, in that we still have a very limited perspective on what's out there in terms of journals, and in particular now related to the Helsinki Initiative, how languages are in many ways disadvantaged and biased against by the very Western indexing systems that we have. So this is one of the kind of key motivations, and we've split this up basically in 5 parts, where at the end we provide the references. So if you're interested in some of these things, I understood the slides would be shared, and of course from the video you can also pick those up if you're interested. But the idea is just to frame a bit of the problem for those of you that are new to this discussion. It's been ongoing for quite some time, but also to propose a solution, since I think many of the scientometrics and bibliometrics papers that are published today always start with lamenting that, okay, we are using Scopus or Web of Science or something else because there's not much out there that provides as clean and as, shall we say, standardized data for journals, without anyone actually taking the bull by the horns and at least attempting to achieve a broader perspective that could facilitate both research purposes, in providing better knowledge about what is the global landscape of scholarly journals, and in that way also in informing science policy, because the more, if we frame all our knowledge and problems by just the existing indexes, we are going to kind of make also policy decisions that are framed in this way. So it's a complicated problem. But one reading tip that I didn't want to just bury into the reference list is this article published last year, which is the most recent and the most, I would say, elaborate attempt at really measuring a considerable part of journals that are not really visible in these mainstream indexes like Scopus and Web of Science, or even others that are a bit more inclusive. So there's a lot out there that isn't picked up by these services, and there's large potential to do something about this, because it has to do with multilingualism, and I think this global participation in science that, you know, what isn't visible and easily discoverable easily just gets lost in the shuffle, so to say. But this is one I really recommend looking up if this is a topic that you're interested in, because it frames it really well and connects back to decades-old discussions where the problems have been identified, but, well, we haven't really gotten that far in doing much about it, because it's, of course, a very huge problem in creating something like this. But the overall problem, excuse the metaphorical images I picked out here, but basically that, well, we only see what we're supposed to see in a way, that these often publisher-connected, publisher-owned, even in sometimes these indexing services, they only provide a limited set of view of the landscape. But this is despite the fact that we've known for a long time that there's more journals and more articles getting published every year. But I would say indexing and keeping track of those journals hasn't gotten really that much. Still a bit of a problem in that we are not getting the full picture, even if we would attempt to do so. And one interesting thing is that how can we say something about what's happening in the scholarly landscape, or with regards to multilingualism, or even what's happening within scientific disciplines, if we are only looking at, you know, half of all journals out there at any point in time that are heavily skewed against international English language journals. So there's a lot of problems that come with this limited view. And yep, that's the reference. The third point is connected back to the first article I highlighted there extra well, that's one of the best evidences for estimating roughly what's out there, but that's also looking mostly at open access journals. There's also subscription-based journals out there that are not that well indexed. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And then something, well, I'm here having my researcher hat on, is that as long as we're using commercial databases that are where you can't really share the data onwards, and it's not easy for anyone else to replicate or continue on building in a cumulative fashion from what you've been doing, well, we'll be kind of treading water or getting nowhere pretty fast, because we can't have kind of an open science approach as long as we are limited to, you know, always everyone having A, access and paid access to these databases, and B, kind of getting something out of the black box when you query for articles or journals for a specific time frame. So I would say it's a large limitation for just knowledge building that we're relying on querying these commercial databases and building all our research on that. It would be much better if we could just create a more open research environment for understanding journals that wouldn't rely on always asking the services for what's the information they contain at any specific point in time. And something I think is quite a surprise to many is that I wouldn't be able to answer these questions in any reliable way, like how many journals are there out there. I think estimates out there have guesstimates with tens of thousands of journals of gaps in between them, because no one really knows, because, well, they aren't tracked that well. And an even bigger question is how many articles are out there, or how many articles were published last year that were peer-reviewed. Who knows? It's impossible to tell because we're bad at keeping track of scholarly information. And this ties back to the whole question about languages as well, that we don't really know. We know that there is an English bias and a Western science bias to the databases that we are currently basing most of our bibliometric research on, but we don't really know how much and what else is out there, and how is this shifting? Is it slowly shifting towards English, or are other languages prospering and growing? And like, we don't really know. So I think it's really fascinating that we are kind of flying in the dark, I would say, in many regards, that we maybe think we know answers to these questions, but we really don't. And that's why I, as a researcher, I've become increasingly hesitant to answer these questions with actual answers, rather than picking up on the problems of what's the problems in the data that we currently have, that they are partly overlapping, as those circles there try to somehow convey, but there's also a lot that's outside of any current circle or any indexing or bibliometric database that we are not keeping track of. So it's bad. But then something that probably won't be solved until I retire someday, in actually having data that would be temporal, that we would have comprehensive evolutionary data sets in a way that we could trace back 10 years. What did the scholarly journal landscape, what was it like 10 years ago? Well, again, no one can say, because if you query these databases, you only get the answer of what's happening right now. What journals are there right now? And they are based more on discovery and providing people searching for articles, searching for content, rather than this bibliometric archaeology that I'm now talking more about. But basically, I think there's a lot of value that could come from having versioned or somehow temporally aware data about the scholarly landscape, so that we would know how is it shifting. Like, what are the new journals that showed up in the last 5 years? There's probably it's a lifetime of work to just compile that from different places and compare lists to each other, and do a lot of work to just figure out one answer to that question one time, but you can't really redo it easily. You have to do the same amount of work each and every time. So it would be nice if we would have some other way, some better way to deal with all of these temporal changes that are happening in the landscape, that are, I think, very central to understanding what's out there. And I think probably many of the people who are working at the big commercial publishers probably have analysts and consultants making a lot of money looking into this, but they aren't really sharing what they're gathering. But I think for the sake of just human knowledge and awareness, it would be nice if this could also be more out in the open, so that we would have information about this as well outside of corporate walls, because it's also kind of bordering on market research, but I think it goes deeper than that. It influences society in quite a big way in what's happening. For example, a topic I've been interested in is how journals become more international, in a way that national journals grow, maybe start to include English as a language, publication language. Some big publisher becomes interested in them, makes a collaboration or buys them up in a way and starts publishing the journals. And one day maybe the national language is just dropped from the journal. So it's kind of a movement I've been looking at from afar, but I don't have hard numbers on how many journals are, of course, striving for internationalization. That might be a goal for many journals, but it's also kind of a detriment to more local language publishing if journals are in mass moving in this direction. Okay, I've been going on too much about the problems here, but basically there are national data sets for scholarly journals, that what countries are fairly good at keeping track in some way about what's getting published. There might be regional data sets. There might be other ways that we can reach publicly available data that can be aggregated and deduplicated and standardized for metadata, so that we could start building something that could be out in the open, shared, and built upon by anyone, basically. But the basic idea is that we would collect as broad of a list of journals as humanly possible, deduplicate that list, and query the ISSN Center for all the metadata that they have regarding them, which includes country, languages, publisher, creation date of the journals, and so forth. There is quite a lot of information there. But the problem for quite a long time in my head has been that using public data from different places, you get also very heterogeneous metadata. So you can't really compare or aggregate a list. But now that the ISSN Center has a portal where you can query based on ISSN, basically you only need the ISSN number to create like a foundation for a more public data set that can be shared out in the open. And this is basically where we are standing now with Janne. We haven't yet included any other national data points here because we're kind of just trying out this concept of how it's working. Crossref and Scopus have publicly available title lists, so it's not illegal to pick out the ISSN numbers from there for just identifying what journals are out there. The earlier article I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation has an open data set, this public knowledge project data set that can be used. Then there's DOAJ, PubMed Central, UnPaywall, and OpenAPC, which some helpful scholars in Germany have aggregated to a readily deduplicated data set that we're using. And then we're also adding in scholarly journals from Finland based on these expert panel reviews. So just kind of trying this out, seeing where do we end up if we go this way before expanding into 20 more national data sets or something like that. So the idea is that we would just get as broad of a list of journals as possible and see what can be done with it and what could be some paths forward. I don't know, Janne, do you want to say a few words about these two slides about the results, or should I fill in?
It's better that you, Mikael, continue because there is quite a lot of noise background.
Okay, yeah, but it's not, I haven't actually kept track of time here. I'll be quite brief, but we did a quick comparison about how many journals appear in between 1 and 5 or all 5 of these sources to see how unique in a way or how complementary they are to each other, to get some kind of gauge about how these 152,000 journals compare to each other. I want to mention here, this also includes inactive journals and probably a lot of conference series and things that aren't strictly journals as we perceive them. So there has been no attempt at cleaning anything yet or doing any augmentation of this. So take this with a lot of many grains of salt, but basically to get some idea of journals that are included in all 5 sources are, for example, 720. So there's not a lot of full overlap between these. But even I would say maybe the most important is the 1 and 2 source view to seeing how many unique journals are found in only that data set. So of course, Crossref has close to 30,000 that are only found in Crossref. The Bielefeld list, which was the DOAJ, PubMed Central, UnPaywall thing, has 16,000 and so forth. So the evidence so far shows that there's, like, even if we take the Finnish national list of scholarly outlets that has a bit over 3,000 unique outlets that is not found in any of these others. So I think it speaks for the utility of this approach, that there's not, it's not redundant to pick out the Finnish data set, even though we have these quite comprehensive international ones as well aggregated. So just getting some feel for the data. But since the topic here is multilingualism, roughly half of the journals based on the ISSN data are English only. But there's also a third that have other languages and about 20% that have multiple publication languages. I'll maybe skip that next diagram because I think the next slide contains basically the same information, just in a more visually pleasing way and easily to convey, in that showing by world region how these languages are distributed in this massive 150,000 something journal data set. And I think it's really, of course, we knew that there are stark differences between regions and the dominance of English and this, but also I think multilingualism is interesting to see that in the Middle East, a third of journals are in multiple languages and not just English or one other language, but actually contain many. So there's still a lot that we have to kind of look into here, but I think it looks promising that once we dig in a bit deeper, looking at various other aspects, I think there is potential to unlock something important from this. But I think we have so far shown that there's a lot that is outside of these commercial databases. And even if they would be the most comprehensive databases in the world, the problem is this sharing of data and being able to build upon it in a more community-oriented way. It would be nice if something like that could exist. And there is a lot of potential to increase just discoverability and visibility and inclusion of more scholarly journals in any services so that they show up when people search with keywords in English or any other languages that are related to it. Because as long as they are hidden in a way from being in these library connected databases, there needs to be work done so that they at least show up in just general web searches, if nothing else. But my dream would somehow be that we could create some, maybe based on crowdsourcing or like a wiki approach or something that could maybe have some influences from how open source software is developed for refining data set, a master data set of information about scholarly journals. I know I might sound like an ideological teenager here, naive to the realities of how laborsome this would be, but basically I think this is something that would be really needed to help balance and have a more comprehensive view and unlock also this temporal aspect of scholarly research on journals, because we are missing this temporal aspect about being able to say anything about how the world looked like 5 years ago, 10 years ago in the scholarly landscape. But that's basically it. I'm eager to hear any comments and questions you might have to this very work in progress thing. Thank you very much for your attention.